Hello, my name is Prue Gordon. I am the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. Welcome to this webinar. We are very fortunate to have with us Brendan Pearson. Brendan has just finished his posting to the OECD, so the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, representing Australia. So today's webinar is all about the OECD, but we're going to, as we generally do, go off down a few different tracks related to the OECD, but also what's happening with the world of trade more broadly. So let me briefly introduce Brendan. Brendan's had an incredible career. He's one, I think there aren't many people in the Australian landscape, political and as well as commercial landscape, with your kind of diverse experience. So Brendan has most recently, as I said, been Australia's ambassador to the OECD. Prior to that, he was a senior advisor to the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. Before that, he had several years with the Minerals Council, including 4 years as its CEO. He's worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's been a journalist in Tokyo. He's been an academic teaching at Cambridge University. So hugely experienced. We're really pleased to have you with us. Brendan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. So not many people know a lot about the OECD. It's one of those organisations that's always been there. We've been a member since 1971. The organisation was formed in 1961. It's basically its origins began really with the Marshall Plan, which established a European Economic Cooperation Organisation. And then by the early 60s, they realised this was a good idea that could work more broadly and include other members. And so there are now 38 members, plus the European Commission, which is not formally a member, but takes part. So the focus has always been on economic cooperation, trade, and of course development. And so over the last 60 odd years, it has progressively expanded from about 14 or 15 countries, mostly European plus Canada and the US. Japan joined in the early 60s. So did Italy. We didn't join until 71, as I said. New Zealand soon after us. And then over the last 20 years or so, there's been an expansion to include more Latins, as well as some of the smaller European countries. So it's joint GDP, global GDP of about 64 trillion. So it's a big player, becoming probably a bit less in terms of its weight. I mean, as China has grown, as Southeast Asia has grown. But most importantly, it's still in demand. There are more countries wanting to join. There are currently 8 countries in the queue, 3 Latins, that's Brazil, Peru and Argentina, 3 small Europeans, Bulgaria, Romania and Croatia. But more importantly, the most important membership applications in, I think, a generation for Australia has been that made by Indonesia and Thailand. And that's a sort of 4-year process, and that's one of the things that we've been most focused on in the last few years is expanding it to include Southeast Asia.
So the fact that countries want to join, that's fascinating in light of issues with other multilateral institutions. But one thing, could I just jump back a step and ask, so what does the OECD actually do? Because it doesn't negotiate agreements like the World Trade Organization so can you just, in a nutshell, what does it do?
So it does develop standards and norms, for example, to govern multinational enterprises, and countries are required to impose some of those standards at the national level. It's not a black law making organisation. It's more about how do we all learn from the successes and failures of different policy approaches that other countries in the membership take, and also outside, and does a lot of outreach to non-members. But it's more and I'll give you just a couple of things that it's done just in the last, and produces a lot of work. I mean, it's got 4,000 employees across sort of 13 major issue areas. The core of the work, I would say, remains in economic analysis and suggestions to governments. I mean, Australia gets a review, if you like, every 2 years, but also, you know, it works on a recent report on trade facilitation and who's doing best and who's not. Work on services trade restrictiveness, does work on agricultural subsidies, industrial subsidies, as we maybe talk about later, as well as the people would have heard the comparative analysis about how countries are doing with education outcomes, the so-called PISA studies, and those are replicated. There's government there's analysis of how we're doing on health compared with other countries, on digitization, on mastering the digital economy. There's a lot of work currently on AI. So across many different sectors, the idea is not we don't whack each other, but we do. It's a self-improvement guide. How do you do better on economic policy? And one of the big challenges at the moment is productivity. So there's a lot of work going into how do countries regain that sort of productivity growth that they were enjoying, particularly 10 years ago.
So do you think sort of an international equivalent of our Productivity Commission?
In many ways, yes. I mean, I describe the accession process, for example, as sort of an economic boot camp for those countries wishing to join. So they want to join to lift their own economic performance, and the OECD accession process, which can take up to 4 years and maybe even a bit longer, tells them, gives them a guide as to the areas that they're going to have to improve on if they're going to gain entry. And most countries, all of those 8, I think, have realised that's the reason they're joining, because in some cases they've reached what they think is the peak of what they can do domestically, from the domestic reform push, and they want a little bit of an extra, not only just a push from external sources. And I think that's particularly those countries who have got a high growth rate and really want to make sure that growth is equitably distributed, and they can do the best that they can to meet various economic reform and growth targets that they've set for itself. I mean, for example, the ambition of Indonesia to be an upper middle income economy by 2045. That's one example of how countries are using the OECD to meet their economic goals.
So can we talk a little bit more about the succession process? Because to be honest, I wasn't aware of it until our last webinar when we interviewed Professor Poppy Winanti from Indonesia, who spoke about Indonesia's succession process. But I thought it was you just paid the money and, you could join this because the focus was on research. So what sort of hoops do countries have to jump through, or economies have to jump through to become a member?
So, I mean, it used to be pretty easy. And I think, there was no accession process for those 14 odd initial countries who joined at the beginning. Progressively, it's got more and more testing. And I would say the big change came in the early to mid-90s when Korea and Mexico and some of the Eastern European countries joined, and it has progressively become more demanding, which I think is a good thing. I mean, I think that's one of the advantages for newly acceding countries, is that they're going to get it's going to be tough, but it will benefit them in the long run. So the process works. The OECD membership sets out a roadmap, which is basically a list of criteria that they must meet. They go across. There's a roadmap for all of, I think, 25 or 26 committees. There's a 3-tier process. Indonesia and Thailand, for example, are now working on what they call an interim memorandum, which is basically an interim gap analysis, what they think they're going to need to do. Second, after that's completed, hopefully about middle of this year, there will be a 12 to 18-month process where the OECD goes through issue by issue and makes its own judgment about how close Indonesia and Thailand are to those standards, those roadmap criteria. And in the third stage, all of the OECD committees meet and they grill acceding countries, say, how far have you got there? How are you meeting this? Where have you got on trade reform? Where have you got on ag reform? Where have you got on digital policy infrastructure? And then once all those are completed, they get the tick. So it's no easy process. I mean, I spent a lot of time with the Croatian, Romanian, Bulgarian delegations in recent years because they're at the sort of the top of that queue. And I think earlier this year, I think Croatia had completed about 20 odd of the 26 committees that it's got to satisfy. And so it's a rigorous turning over of their economic and social policies. And I think, and that's why there's so much interest, because countries feel like that's a good driver of reform.
That's really interesting. So they obviously see benefit in it to go through that process. Mm-hmm. And I've known in the past, sometimes when you're trying to make domestic reform, which is difficult, it involves paying for different sectors of the economy, having an outside element helps government do that. Often they can say, well, it's a requirement of the OECD and there are all these benefits that we gain from being a member of this other outside international organization. So helps the process internally. But it's interesting in terms of the criteria that OECD is identifying for countries to meet, because obviously probably from 1950, 60 through probably the last, I guess, mid teens, 20 teens, maybe a bit later, the underlying assumptions were about open markets. It was the Washington Consensus. It was reducing barriers to trade, deregulation, enabling market forces to work, was really the fundamental principles underlying so many international economic relationships. Obviously, the WTO, OECD in particular, I think, was a real star of that economic approach. There have been challenges to that regularly from developing countries. And of course, the East Asian countries early on, but less so more recently, promoted sort of this industry policy to develop domestic industries, which would then enable them to compete internationally. And now, of course, China, which has been a major player in the global economy now for the last 20, 30 years, obviously follows a state-led, export-led economic growth policy, which is contrary in many respects to what the OECD promotes. So is the OECD still continuing to promote Washington Consensus-like policies and principles for countries to implement, or is there a shift there?
I think the OECD, what its reaction, if you like, to the increased popularity of industrial policy has been, look, it's and it's by no means endorsing the China approach. It's sought to put some guardrails around where industrial policy should go. It recognises that some countries are going in that direction, in part in response to the China challenge. But I guess you could say it's saying, look, under certain circumstances, it's justified. Under other circumstances and other policy instruments, there are risks. So I don't think you would say it's by any means attracted to the state-run non-market approach, but it does recognise that this has become a little bit more popular than it used to be, and there are some obvious reasons why, which we will probably come to a little bit later. But I think that in general, that pro-market instinct that has guided the OECD for a long time still remains the overwhelming narrative that the OECD wants to promote. And still, for example, those roadmaps that we talked about. Now, some of them are pretty general, but the underlying theme of those is more open markets, a pro-competition approach.
It's interesting because, yes, so many challenges coming at that kind of approach from climate change advocates as well as national security concerns. Yep. Before we start to get into, I guess, some of the specific work that the OECD has been doing, I'd love to hear just your impression of, I guess, Australia's role in the OECD and what Australia gets out of being a member of the OECD.
I mean, I think, and this is a retrospective look, so it's, I hope I'm not being unfair to either the OECD or previous Australian governments. I mean, I think we didn't get much because, when we joined, it was a relatively straightforward process, as you hinted at a bit earlier. I think our accession process took 6 months, and that was probably just the delivery of the requisite documents. I think where we benefited most from the OECD was it was a source of support for those reformers in the mid-1980s, and I include, I give most credit here to former Prime Minister former Treasurer Keating, and then later Prime Minister, and on frankly on both sides of politics, OECD was a really good support, not a cheerleader, but a support, and a source of data and intellectual thought leadership, if you like, to help us get through that period, of substantial reform, 85 to 92, and then onwards thereafter. And so much so that there was, I remember Gary Banks, former Productivity Commission chair, was asked to participate in a conference at the OECD in the early 2000s, and the subject of which was the Australian reform model. And how did Australia produce this sort of reform, against the odds and those opponents of reform in some cases. So, and I think our learning was a bit more iterative, and I think across. But I mean, I think we use OECD. We've used it on trade reform many times, in the lead up to the end of the Uruguay round, plus afterwards, when Jeff Raby was based in at the OECD in Paris, and he was pushing the built-in agenda. Let's keep working on trade reform after the Uruguay round. But I talk regularly to participants who've come to Canberra, from Australian government agencies. One of them I'm always struck by is the ACCC. They come and they join, and they, the chair of the ACCC, Gina Cascott-Lee, used to tell me, we get a lot out of this because we talk to our counterparts, our peers, and we learn, from each other about, what issues are, confronting each other, how they might do it, how in some cases they try to be picked apart by, global corporations who maybe just want to deal with competition authority one-on-one. Well, if they know that they're talking, it's a bit hard to do that. And I've had the same conversations with David Gruen from the Bureau of Statistics. Obviously, Treasury are very important players at the OECD because we do those yearly reviews. We're engaged in debates on how do we speed up productivity or reignite productivity gains. And I had a quick look at the last month on the work that some publications the OECD's issued. And the first one I hadn't seen this, but I knew it was happening, was a report on trust in drivers of trust in public institutions in Australia. So Australia's the sole focus, and it went through how we are tracking, trust in government, trust in federal government, trust in state governments, trust in the parliamentary process, trust in political parties, etc. And so those things are ongoing and comparable with other countries. We've also had, there was a global debt report recently. There was a paper, CBAM, what to expect from CBAM, just published a couple of weeks ago. And another one in mid-March on real wage growth in OECD countries. Where's the real wage growth coming, and where is it lagging? So, when I'm asked this, there's one conversation, or many conversations I had with the former US ambassador, before he came to Paris, he was the governor of Delaware. And he said, I knew this joint existed. He said, when I was governor, what I used to look for is comparative data. But if we could have matched that, not just against our peers in other states, but against, countries and subnational governments elsewhere, that would have been, a great help to his institution. So one of the things that the OECD has to work on is to make sure that there's a lot of things that we don't know. And I'll come back to a little bit later, one little modest attempt that we've got to improve that within the delegation in Paris.
Yeah, just getting the word out. So it's sort of like an international brains trust in a way.
Yeah. And one of the challenges is getting the information to the decision makers who need it. If what's worked and what hasn't. There's a recent reporting on investment incentives. Now we all of us around the world, whether it's state governments or even regions and national governments, are out trying to compete for investment. And so this report just compares what different countries do. Not sure that it's quite as judgmental as maybe sometimes we like. This does work or this doesn't, but it lays out the material. So there's a lot of work across sectors, and I think one of the things that we've got to try and improve on is making sure that the right decision makers, not always just the big departments in Canberra, but elsewhere, know about it. And most importantly, all of this work is now on the web for nothing. There used to be paywalls, and I think they realised that the paywalls were counterproductive. And so from 1 July last year, a lot of this material is out there.
That's brilliant.
You've got to know where to look.
Yeah, well, yes. And I've been to the OECD website a few times and it can get a bit confusing, but even if we can just send people in the right direction, it'd be helpful. That'd be good. One question I had, so many international organizations are political. They have, different countries have their specific pet issues that they like to pursue or like to avoid having discussed in international organizations. How political is the OECD?
It can be. Obviously we don't agree with every other member every day. One of the areas where we have obvious disagreements is on agriculture. And one of the specialties areas for the OECD was the development of subsidies, a process to measure agricultural support. And that's been going since 1987. And it does important work in highlighting just how that's grown. And now it's up to about $850 billion US. And one of the things that we thought was important is that we also consider the climate imperative for agricultural subsidy reform. In other words, a string of international bodies, not just the OECD, has said unless this unrestricted increases in agricultural support has climate implications. You know, if you overproduce, you overproduce CO2. Now, that's one of the areas where we've had a lot of opposition, primarily from the European Union, but also more passively from others who use ag subsidies. So that's one area where I think we've helped raise the profile again, and given it a little bit more of a push with the climate imperative, but it's still fiercely resisted. Until recently, the European Union, for example, has refused to disaggregate the data, the support data, subsidy levels, from within its membership, 28 members. And we think that's a little bit ridiculous. We've been doing this stuff for 38 years, and we should know what the numbers are for Germany, France, and the other major economies. And all of the new acceding countries have to provide that. So why shouldn't the existing membership? But that's one of the political areas, and climate's tricky as well on occasions. A little bit more. Some of that work happens in the IEA, which is a part of the OECD family, but runs a different agenda. But it's not anything like the universal institutions. I mean, these are countries that have got a reasonably, convergent view of the world, and I think that's still the case. And I think it's now that might be being challenged just now, with the US having different ideas about what open trade means. But I think for the most of its 60 odd years of existence, he's been relatively spared some of the political shenanigans that might take place, and pretty much free of grouping mentality. I mean, it still can be Eurocentric in a way. It's 26 of the 38 members are from Europe, but I think that's coming, and that's why it's so important that we get half a dozen or 5 new members, 3 from Latin America, 2 from Southeast Asia.
I should say we're recording on the 2nd of March, and most people, I imagine, would know
April.
2nd of April. And President Trump will soon be announcing his fair and reciprocal trade plan. And based on comments made in the press, we're expecting that every country will have a new tariff rate from the US levied against it. So this represents like a radical departure from the US's commitments in the World Trade Organization to keep tariffs locked in at certain minimum levels, their commitments in trade agreements. And I think one of the reasons why I was really keen to talk to you, Brendan, was because you wrote a great op-ed in the Australian Financial Review talking about a piece of work that was done at the OECD that looked at subsidies, as you've just been talking about, subsidies that countries are paying to their industries that make them more competitive internationally, and in many respects tilts the playing field to the benefit of their domestic companies. And the subsidy report found that essentially China was one of the greatest subsidizers. And I think when you look at what President Trump is doing, both this term and in his first term, so many of the US administration's actions were directed at trying to counter Chinese competition. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that report.
Yeah, I mean, this has been a challenge for the OECD for most of its existence, certainly since the 80s. Ag support was much easier to count and compare. It's always been much harder in the manufacturing and industrial subsidies area, and so but the OECD's had a really red hot go at this, particularly in the last 10 years. They thought, I mean, in part because it's harder because governments often don't want to, release this information. It's not for domestic purposes, but for comparison by others. And so I think one of the things they tried different models, and so they came up with this what they call the magic database, and it's it's basically analysing firm level payments, and they get that data from those firms' public reporting. Because in a sense, there's much more comparability of the way different governments measure or require their companies to report than there is than governments impose on themselves, if you like.
Mm.
So, and they focused on the larger companies in 14 sectors, and those companies that would contribute at least to 60% of production globally. So they're the bigger end. And they're progressively expanding the sectors and the companies that they'll cover. Now, the findings have been supported by other work that has been going on in the OECD on sector by sector. There's a lot of work on the steel sector, a lot of work on aluminium. Anyway, as you say, the end result is that in steel, they've worked out that Chinese companies are subsidised 10.7 times more than any other than the OECD average. And in some cases, and then in other sectors like aluminium, semiconductors, cement, glass, solar panels. Excuse me. All those. In other sectors, so at least 15% of revenue coming from subsidies. And the average in the OECD and the average amongst other countries is 0.6% of revenue. So it's a big deal. And I think, frankly, that's why, and I think when you think about the US reaction over not just this Trump period, but the Trump one, but also the Biden administration, I think it's eaten away at their faith in the multilateral system, because they say that this China model, this state-run non-market, is out of bounds for the WTO rules to capture. And I think they made a very strong point of that in the last Biden WTO compliance report to Congress, which was published in January this year. It's worth a look. But I read a piece by Mike Froman, who's former USTR and head of the Council on Foreign Relations. He wrote that in a few weeks ago. He said, that China changed the international order. China changed the way that international trade works, and now we, the US, are embracing. So the only way to beat China is to join it. Subsidies, trade restrictions. Now, I hope that's not an extended. I hope that's not a new normal. But I think we have to admit that the current system, the one that we enjoyed for a long time, is going to be hard to rejig. And so, on the steel and aluminium, and on the measures that might be applied tomorrow, I don't quite understand why the US is smearing these things across every one of their major trading partners, when they know, or they ought to know, that the biggest single cheater, if you like, is China. That doesn't mean I'm endorsing whacking massive tariffs on everything from China, but I just think a slightly more surgical approach is warranted, because if one country is subsidising a product 10 times more than the next, and then you hit them with the same level of tariff, you're just going to institutionalise the status quo, and or give them even more of market share. And that's the one thing that worries me a little bit, is that by, I think UNIDO, which is the UN body, economic body, predicted recently that by 2030, China will account for 45% of manufacturing across the world. Now that's a lot of market power, and this gives China a lot of coercive power when dealing with suppliers, and a lot of coercive power when dealing with buyers. And I worry about that.
Mm. And I think President Trump's tariffs are aimed, as he says, at trying to rebuild US manufacturing. But the theory would say government intervention in markets generally doesn't produce optimal outcomes in terms of value and efficiency. So the theory would suggest if China had continued or continues on down that path, ultimately they're going to eat away at their own economy. And I think if you look at return on investment in China compared to return on investment in the US, I think it's 10 times less in China, looking at the last data that I saw. So, but I guess the question is the scale of China and the speed at which they've grown. We're sort of in a position where countries, and the US in particular, feels, well, we can't just let the theory try and work its way through. We have to do something. And as you said, that's both, and I think President Obama saw that, first Trump, President Biden, and now the second Trump presidency. But in adopting policies similar to China's in terms of industry policy under President Biden, for example, or imposing tariffs to try and build manufacturing within the US, ultimately, again, theory would say they're not going to work. They're not actually going to rebuild manufacturing because they're going to present protectionist walls, which reduce competition, reduce efficiency, increase costs, and all, sort of economic theory 101. So we're entering a really scary time, if you ask me, and for small countries like Australia, who've relied so heavily on the rules-based system and cooperation and clarity on how countries are going to treat trade and investment, then very, very scary time. One question I had, which really goes to, do you think the OECD has a role to play in this new environment?
I do. Just on your point, I mean, there's some analysts who are measuring, there's fiscal space that China has, but it's not unlimited. It's not finite, and these subsidies cost a lot of money. Probably the biggest single form of subsidy is below market finance, and some people have suggested it can be as much as 300 basis points, which is substantial, and also a tolerance. If you don't want, whether you're the central government or a provincial government, you do not want the plant or the manufacturing complex in your province to go under. So there's a lot of fiscal pressure on provincial governments and an increasing amount of pressure on. Now, I don't think anyone is suggesting that that's at risk in the near term, but Rhodium Group, which is I think one of the best analytical firms following China, has done a lot of interesting work on this. And I've even spoken informally to Americans who think, oh, maybe we just have to do what we did in the 80s to the Soviet Union, just outspend them, and I think that's a slightly more. I don't know if that comparison really can be applied to this moment where the West can outspend China to claw back that 45% that we're looking at. As for the OECD, I mean, I think that's why I'm so encouraged, but also regard the work that they're doing in this magic database and related work, not just that's in the Trade Directorate. There's another directorate called Science and Technology that's doing a lot of work on industrial policy. Transparency is the first thing. We've had it on ag, we've had it on fisheries, we've had it on fossil fuels for a while, but industrial policy isn't really about, I think it's not really about tariffs. It's about subsidies, and we need that, and we need to, subsidies rulemaking was never really all that stringent when it comes to, there's sort of big gap in industrial policy anyway, industrial subsidies. So the OECD, I think its role upstream of the WTO is to really get going so that we know not just the top 460 companies in the world, not just the 120 odd Chinese companies that are covered by this database, that it covers other sectors. It's only 14 at the moment. There's big gaps. So I think there's a lot we can do, and to its great credit, the Australian government has put more money into, as a what they call a voluntary contribution into work in this area. And I think we've been encouraging others to do it. I think the Americans are interested, and I think once they get up past all of this current stuff, I think that is one of the most important, both from an economic perspective, but from a security perspective. As I said, there's a lot of coercive power once you get up to beyond 50% in any sector, and we're already well past that in many. So I think that's that, and the guardrails for those countries in the OECD and like-minded with the OECD. Okay, look, if you're going to do industrial policy, don't do it like this. You might do it this way. These things work better. As for the tariff policy, I've been trying to think of a silver lining. The one minor silver lining seems to have converted a lot of people to be anti-tariff, who weren't always anti-tariff, and that's good. And I think we've passed that a long time in Australia, but I just reminded what Ursula von der Leyen said recently about the tariff as a consumer tax, and I said, said to myself, well, Ursula, there are a lot worse. There's something worse than a tariff, and that's a tariff, and that's a quota, and that's what we face across a whole range of areas in agriculture into Europe. So I'm just hoping that there's that silver lining is felt, and maybe as I think this is a longer shot. If the US can convince others to reduce their barriers, they won't just reduce them against the US. They'll reduce them unilaterally. I think that's probably less likely to happen. I know that one or two countries have said they'll do that. They'll reduce their, in this reciprocal negotiation, they'll reduce their barriers on this product. But so far they've said only to the US. So that's the trading system sort of coming apart, literally. The old MFN notion,
Yes, I do. Most favoured nation. I guess what silver lining I'm hoping is that there's a new appreciation for rules. If we go through a period of major turmoil and just uncertainty, which we're certainly there now, new valuing of the rules provided by the WTO system, possibly. We'll see. It's really unclear where things will go. One final question I had, considering how important the members are and their contribution to the OECD and their support for the OECD. Looking at the US's role in the OECD, you were there obviously during the Biden administration principally. Had the new appointee representative for the US started at the OECD before you left? And if not, I guess, how did the US see their role in the OECD?
So I think, the new ambassador, the Biden ambassador left on the 21st or the 20th, and there's been no replacement still. So, and I mean, I left at the end of February, and by then it was still very much holding responses. But I think we'll start to see a little bit more clarity. I mean, I think the IEA has got a bit more clarity from the US about where it wants to go, because the energy team in the US system is up and running and has been, and they've got a albeit with a different narrower mandate. So that I think it's probably still not clear across the board. I think the administration is waiting on the State Department and the Commerce Department and the others in the USTR who deal with the OECD for a little bit more, probably for the April 2 announcements. But I mean, I know that the Secretary General's been to Washington and had a good hearing. I don't think the OECD is in and when there was an executive order covering a review of international bodies, there was a number of international institutions singled out. OECD wasn't one of those. I think 80% of the OECD's work program is, largely consistent with US government thinking, even under this administration. There might be quibbling about, and obviously the trade policy approach is a little different. But as I say, that's been an evolution too. I can remember a conversation where in the recent years where we were negotiating the annual ministerial statement, and one of the lines that came back from the US, this is, obviously the Biden administration, was trade liberalisation is an outdated concept. So that, I mean, this moving away from as you said, the Washington consensus has been in progress for a little while. But I do think also that there are areas where the US will want continuity, not change. And the work on industrial subsidies is one of those. The cooperation on semiconductors is another, which is very important to them from a geostrategic perspective. And the work on AI within a like-minded group with some, as well as with some other partners, has really accelerated recently. So that, and I think the notion of economic security, this intertwining of the two camps, the old camps that probably didn't talk to each other all that much, the trade community and the intelligence or security community. The OECD can provide a venue for that conversation, and can provide a way that can maybe evolve the notions of economic security in one that's a little bit more consistent with keeping markets open, except in narrow fields. I mean, it's that notion of small yard, high fence. So that's where that's something that the WTO finds harder to do, because it's a more contested, negotiated, space with 164 countries. OECD is better, more capable, and having closed door discussions on occasions as they do. And there's been some good reforms to get the right people together into those conversations in the recent years, and I think that will continue and expand. So there's a lot of work that the OECD can do, and a lot of places it can situate itself to help this discussion in a way that's not, we don't have delegations throwing apples and tomatoes at each other. Because if I do think you can have if you've got a group of 40, as I said, 60 odd% of the global economy who can sort of work out some of their differences, learn from what works, where China is a problem and where it's not, and where it's competing fairly and where it's not, then I think we have a better chance of some sort of. Now, I don't, it's going to be hard to write rules on this. Whilst China's in the format that it's in, it's non-market, state-led, I think there'll be a lot of distrust. And so progressively we've got to break down that distrust. And that's not to say there won't be big arguments across the Pacific.
But just even having good minds, thinking through what's happening, possible solutions, impacts, ways of dealing with it. It's just so important at this point in time. I said that would be the last question, but I did have one final one. There's been talk of China joining the OECD. What do you reckon, in our lifetime?
Well, certainly not in mine.
I'm not that far behind.
older than you, but no, not really. Then it becomes a universal body. I think that's the reality. There's all sorts of different views within the OECD about what is the carrying capacity of the organisation, in terms of membership. When is too many? So once this current expansion is completed, that would be 46 members. But I think without substantial reform, including some sort of political reform, I mean, you're meant to be a democracy for a start. I don't see, a discussion on China's membership in the next generation. But who knows? I mean, what has to happen is the OECD is still seen as an indispensable source of objective data, focused on some of these things that are most important to the future of the global economy. And I think that, and that means getting the Brazils, the Argentinas, the Indonesias, and the Thailands into the group, and that will then open the door for maybe, I'm speculating now, but Singapore, Vietnam in due course, and that just means it's no longer seen as a bunch of rich countries in the frankly mostly northern hemisphere, and it also means that OECD had a lot of this territory to itself for a long time. There weren't thousands of think tanks around in the early 60s, and it's got to find a place for itself, maybe providing something additional and different, and it's the data stuff, but it's also the convening power. I think that's one of the things that OECD could be doing a bit more of, particularly in these areas. Drawing these different communities together to make trade policy.
So important.
And what's a dual use technology? All that stuff. The whole thing about what do you need to keep open? What do you need to keep inside the small yard and high fence?
Figuring out the details. That's where you need good brains and good data and good research, not just broad sweeping statements. Brilliant. Thank you, Brendan. We will put links on our website to the different OECD access points, just to make it easy for people to start looking into all of the papers that the OECD is producing, the data that they're producing. But thank you so much for talking to ACITI today. We really appreciate all the work you did for Australia at the OECD and that you've done for Australia in different capacities. But really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights today.
Thanks, Prue, and to your followers.
Thanks. Talk to you soon. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.